Okay, well, welcome. My name is Trace Fooshee. I'm a senior advisor with Aite Novarica's fraud and AML unit, and I am very honored, and it is a great privilege to moderate this panel of fraud experts. We have an interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about managing identity and finding that optimal balance between improving client experience and maintaining security. So I will ask, first of all, that my panelists give a brief introduction, and we'll start with you, PJ.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Delighted, honored to be on this panel. And my name is PJ Rojo. I'm the co-founder of About Fraud, which is basically a global community for fraud fighters. We provide educational resources. It's kind of a passion project that just kept growing. So I've connected with some of you folks over the years, and happy to provide my educational insight into this topic and join this great panel. So thank you.
We're lucky to have you, PJ. Thank you for coming. Ken?
Yeah, so I'm Ken Palla. I managed online security at Union Bank for about 15 years. I retired in early 2019, and since then I've been doing a mixture of retirement and consulting and putting a focus on scams and trying to understand scams along with you, Trace, and what's going on and what are things we can bring to bankers' attention to possibly improve the situation of reducing scams.
Yeah, Ken's modest. I like to call Ken the mayor of Fraudville. He is known. There are a few people who know as many things as Ken, and who know as many fraud fighters as Ken does. So we are greatly honored to have you with us today, Ken. Thank you. And last but not least, Blair.
Hey everybody, like PJ, I'm super humbled to be here with this team of experts today. Thank you for having me. I'm the founder and president at AuthenticID, and AuthenticID is a next generation identity company. We focus on making it much more difficult for a synthetic or a bad actor to either take over an account or to create a fake identity using novel technologies that I think are next generation compared to where we've been, which is, I know, one of the topics you wanted to bring up. Thanks, Trace.
Well, it is, and it's a great segue because, yeah, it's identity and managing identity is a huge challenge. Myself, I used to be a practitioner. I used to be a fraud executive at a large bank in the southeastern U.S. and was active, very active, in a lot of the industry trade groups, and the one in particular with the Bank Policy Institute's BITS Steering Committee for Fraud Reduction. We talked at length a lot about the challenges that we faced as an industry, not just individually within our own organizations, but that the industry faces, more broadly. And I'm going to quote one of my peers on the steering committee who famously said, "Identity is broken." And I was like, well, that pretty well sums it up. I mean, if I had to point to the one thing that I think is sort of the root cause of so much of our struggle with whether it's with first party fraud, whether it's with mule activity, whether it's with synthetics, whether it's with scams. A lot of it, I think, traces back to the fact that it is really hard to be able to distinguish between, one identity and the next, and be able to verify that the person that you're doing business with is in fact the person that you're supposed to be doing with. And this is not just a problem that's specific to the banking industry. This is really true now for everyone. I mean, anyone who has enters into an account-based relationship with consumers is increasingly on the hook and bears some degree of responsibility for being able to manage and understand who it is they're dealing with. So I was greatly honored to have you with us, Blair, and thanks again for sponsoring this panel. So With regard to managing identity, I think it's safe to say that there's an art to the science of managing identity. I mean, we know a lot about the science of it, but I think there is so much to it, there's so much nuance to it that it's fair to say that there's an art to managing it. The conventional wisdom remains pretty well established that the science part of it is all about overlapping layers of controls designed to build up a picture of the identity that we hope will accurately match a valid identity. The art of it, to me at least, lies in how clever you can be and how you arrive at a prediction that is ultimately based on incomplete information. Because you're never going to have, you know, I got my start myself. I got started in fraud many years ago, sometime around 2010, running our fraud analytics group. And after several years of managing statisticians and mathematicians, I came away with a healthy respect for forecasting. And in particular, that you know, anyone who claims that they have a 100% prediction of anything is telling you something. If there's one thing to be certain of, there's nothing to be certain of. But that kind of stems back to that incomplete picture. In other words, you can gather all the data in the world and still not know with 100% degree of certainty that you're dealing with the person who they claim to be. So that's kind of what I mean by incomplete information. But despite all the wonderful tools that we have out there, it still comes down to making an educated guess. It's what it really comes down to. And the good news, of course, is that the tools that are available today are better than ever in diminishing the uncertainty, not eliminating it, but diminishing it. And adding to the challenge, though, is the enormous pressure to make it easy for customers to do business with us. And I think that has been an undeniable force, right? Market force behind what's been driving a lot of this, the challenge in balancing these two things. So first item for the panel to discuss that I'd like to turn to is I'd like to hear from them their thoughts on how far we've come in the last decade in terms of finding a proper balance between security and client experience. And where are we now relative to where we were, and where do you think things are going? So Blair, let's start with you.
Gosh, there's a lot of questions within that question there, Trace. How far have we come? Well, as you can all tell, I'm pretty old. I mean, I come from the day when we proved identity, when just by asserting our name and our social security number, and a credit bureau was able to take your social and run it and see if they'd seen you before. And if they had and your name was associated with it, you were you. Obviously, and that worked okay. But things have changed dramatically. I mean,
until it did, yeah.
Data breaches have really just changed that altogether. And I think that, we're still using data, we're still using knowledge a little bit too much. So we've got further to go, in my opinion, Trace. In a lot of cases, a lot of enterprises are still deploying knowledge-based authentication questions. And I'm going to show a slide in a moment that shows you how easy it is to create a fake identity or to be able to get all the knowledge-based authentication answers for you, the make and model of your first car, your cat's name, the amount of your mortgage payment last month. And this isn't dark web stuff. It doesn't take deep investigation. It's right out on the surface web. But where do I think we're going? I'm going to challenge the statement that you made just a moment ago, where we can't get to 100% confidence in who we're dealing with. Because I think the tools are there and the infrastructure is there to where we can be 100% confident in who we're transacting with. And if there's proper enrollment done and proper vetting up front into a biometric platform, by using biometrics for authentication, you can know precisely who you're transacting with every single time. It's immune to things like device biometrics, where multiple biometric modalities from different people in the family, or maybe somebody that just got a hold of your phone, are enrolled. So I think there's hope. I think there is a chance. Are we there yet? No, but when you see FIDO2 being endorsed by all the major operating system manufacturers. You've got Mac, Microsoft, iOS, and Google all behind this. And, I think they're going to be making those tools available for free. And with proper MFA, with the proper adaptive risk and deploying that FIDO2 authentication at critical parts of a journey, we can get pretty darn close.
What's interesting there, Blair, is we do have FIDO2 that's out there, but at the same time, when we look at many banks today, the banking world is still in the land of OTP. And so the ability to, get by OTP, I mean, there's so many ways that you can capture a code. So you have that FIDO2, but you still have people back in the OTP space. So when I look at this, it's almost like we were making a lot of good progress in the last couple of years, but now when people seem to be stuck in the OTP space as opposed to going to phishing resistant, it creates much more vulnerability. And Trace, the concept you talk about of, do I know this is the right person? I mean, you have a couple things going on. You've got the OTP can be compromised, so it's not going to be the right person. You've got the man in the browser, man in the middle types of things that compromise that. You also have, I think, the sophistication or smartness of the fraudsters going to the edge of transactions. So like I saw the other day where one of the large banks, their ATMs were being compromised because somebody put glue in the card slot and forced the customer to tap the card. And for some reason, when you tap the card after you got your money, it didn't close the account out. And so the fraudster was the one behind who put the glue in the slot and then told the customer, oh, just tap it. If you got your card, just tap it, you can get your money. The customer taps, gets his money, moves on. Fraudster goes in and cleans out the account. So the fraudsters are getting much sharper on the edge. And so that's where I think we really have to think about what I call, and we'll talk about later, I know, the thing of smart friction, that we've got to think about what is the, providing more security and maybe less of the customer experience, just because there's more smartness on the part of the fraudsters and also the nation state kinds of stuff. So I tend to be more cautious now. I guess I'm kind of the opposite of you, Blair, at the moment, is I'm more cautious about how controls have to be in place because of all the examples of fraud that I see. They're very fascinating, if you will, I guess.
Those are all good points. PJ, where do you think we are relative to where we've come from? Are you cautiously optimistic?
Yeah, it's interesting because you guys all talk about how the tech has evolved and the data, which is totally true. And some people are still falling back on OTPs and things that are not effective. But the menu of options is really great, which you would think we'd be further ahead, creating more secure experiences, better customer experience. But I would say we're probably pretty stagnant we probably haven't evolved as much as we would like, not because we haven't provided better technology and menu of options. They're there, whether you're using them or not is a different question. But what's evolved with our technology is, one, the fraudsters' capabilities and the lengths they'll go to do certain things, where you just almost have to invoke friction at some points to keep up with some of their MOs compared to 10, 20 years ago. And then also the pressures of the businesses to be faster and, the most amazing customer experience, on demand, getting everything right when you need it. So, beyond 10 years, 20 years ago, early digital banking and internet. And, I don't think those same pressures were there. So you're in a climate where fraudsters are really clever and active as far as how far they'll go. Businesses are being pressured to still kind of sign up more accounts and do it digitally and do it without friction. And so all those pressures kind of balance out all the great tech and data out there. So we're armoring ourselves better, but there's increased strain still on the business from these kind of external things that they can't really control because they have to deliver. So it's almost like I feel like we're in the same place, and just trying to keep pace with those external pressures. And it would be a lot worse if we weren't evolving with our tech and our data. Like if we were standing still, we wouldn't have that menu of options. So at least we're there. But I do think the balance is still not much different from what it was before. With those factors in play.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and certainly, an axiom, right, among fraud fighters that, fraud is always changing. It's always morphing. It's always evolving. But what I find curious, especially in the identity management space, is that despite that being a fairly universally accepted truism, we tend to do our screening only at discrete moments in time throughout the duration of the relationship. We look at, we really do, as we should, the bulk of our examination at enrollment, for example. Right, and there's a very good reason for that, because you want to be very careful about who you let in the front door.
Often regulated too.
Yeah, and of course it's regulated. But we also monitor it, right, at every interaction in the form of authentication. But what's curious to me is that despite the fact that we often manage our businesses based on sort of an evolving and ever accumulating body of intelligence on the value of a customer, we don't always do the same thing from a risk perspective. Because again, we're kind of looking at it at very discrete points in time, as opposed to actually looking at it more holistically. I call this trend in general, the whole idea of continuous identity monitoring. I'm curious to know, again, from the panel, if there is a trend towards continuous identity monitoring and during multiple stages of the relationship life cycle. I'm curious what the panel thinks about this trend and where we think it's heading. And let's start with you, Ken.
Well, I think it's interesting. I'm not sure how many people are really doing it. I think a lot of people, the whole concept of continuous monitoring, I think is one people might hear, they might talk about, but I'm not sure how much they're doing. I know we've had it where we talk about for transaction monitoring, look at the login, look at the other transactions. And even that, people talk about it, but not a lot of people are doing. So I think your concept of continuous identity management, you make a good analogy of what's the value of a customer. You look at that for lifetime. But I don't think we're really doing the identity of the customer, over time. That's just my sense. I don't think we're there on that one.
So Blair, is that something you think we can and should be doing, or is that something that you guys help with?
I think there's a great deal of value in doing continuous monitoring. I agree with Ken, though. It's not really very widely deployed. It's a pretty controversial topic. I know that Twitter just unrolled that for all their workforce, for example. And, the people there kind of hate it. They hate Twitter knowing that they've been not typing on their computer for 5 minutes. I mean, it throws off an alarm. So, but it's pretty valuable, because at the same time, the Twitter employees have access to some pretty incredible assets. And by monitoring how they interact with that device, you can be confident that it's really still Ken interacting with that device when he's accessing a very secure asset. So I think it's a must. I think the Twitter employees need to get over it. I mean, because we're protecting such valuable things that it's just needed and required, but we've got a long way to go. It does need to be deployed much further. I definitely like the workforce application of that technology. And when it comes to consumers, I think consumers enjoy a little bit of friction. And with this continuous monitoring, though, it's really frictionless. It's kind of adding to the fraud prevention, but it's not really seen or felt by the consumer. They don't have to do an overt act. It's just, over time, you're able to build up what that behavior is and know that it's really Ken interacting with that device the next time or the third time around. Is it something we offer today? Not yet, but stay tuned, Trace.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the one of the great promises of doing a more deliberate job, let's say, of monitoring identity, risk, and value over time is the whole. It would manifest itself in the capacity to be able to customize offers to customers based on what we understand to be not just their value, but also the propensity that they may represent in terms of risk, right? And so that helps us to do a lot better job of customizing our own, not just our own, the profitability of that customer, but also the downside of the profitability of that customer. So, PJ, what do you think there?
Yeah. And that made me think of like when you onboard somebody, you're maybe not sure if they're, they have a thin profile. Could they be a synthetic? Could they be trying to pump up their credit score? But you approve them, right? So, but let's keep monitoring their transactions on what they're doing and the behavior they're, does it continually look like they're just trying to pump up their credit score? And then, if they still look good, but maybe you max out the offers on new credit cards you offer them, like you're not going to give them the a really high balance. So like there's different decisions you can make, and those are tricky to do, but that's one of the things that made me think of. But for just the concept in general, there's, I think, silos within organizations that makes that hard. Like there's tech and data that say, hey, we're a platform, we'll do it at onboarding, we'll do it at transaction monitoring, we're authenticating the account, but the data and the people still operate in silos. The originations team, and then you have the transaction monitoring team. So I think those are some of the challenges, especially at bigger orgs. Like how do you bring these teams together, blend them together to be able to look at it at onboarding, and then not just say, well, that's not my issue anymore, that's the transaction monitoring. How do you keep this journey going with the tech and data and the teams? That seems to be one of the challenges, and I think everyone agrees on this panel and probably beyond that. In theory, it makes a ton of sense. Like, of course, and in practicality, like Ken said, it's harder. It's been harder probably for people to actually deploy that.
Yeah, to quote Homer Simpson, in theory, communism works. So, yeah.
I think one thing that does help is behavioral biometrics is one way is it still the same person this session, next session, and so on. So that's something I think that helps in what you're talking about, Trace. If people do that, you can at least get a sense behaviorally, it's that.
Well, and in fact, I want to pick up on that because I want to also acknowledge PJ's input here because I think it's a really important one. That is, it's hard, right? Doing something like that would be particularly difficult. Modeling risk of say first-party fraud, very different than modeling risk from third-party fraud. But I would also point out too that with regard to we have a growing problem in both first party and third party, or at least a lot of our data points in that direction for 2022 is the number one driver of fraud losses from 2022 according to our data has been check fraud, with scams bringing up number 2. And when you look at check fraud, that's both third party check fraud and first party check fraud. And of course, scams is a really pernicious problem, as you know. And so,
outrageous.
Yeah, and I think a lot needs to be done about it. But one of the things that I would argue that there's potential for us to do more is in modeling the risk that a given customer is susceptible or at risk of falling victim to scams, and I think there again is another application of where this might actually be helpful. Is it hard? Yeah, it's definitely hard, but is it possible? I think it's at least plausible. So yeah. All right. Well, let's pivot now. We'll talk a little bit about, we talked about continuous identity monitoring, and Another thing I want to pick up on there is something that I think all three of you touched on to a certain degree. Is the degree to which having that sort of view or that perspective on the identity enables us to customize how we treat that customer, right? And that benefits not just security, but also our client experience. It also brings up to me this idea of smart friction, because to me it's about smart friction is really about being able to apply friction at the for the right person at the right time and under the right circumstances, right? So, and that's hard to do unless you have a fairly holistic view of who each of those personas are in your portfolio. So let's see. Let's start off with hearing from you all on what you think about what smart friction is. And maybe if you could give us an example, and this time I'll start with you, PJ.
Yeah, it's going back to the scams. It kind of makes me think of scam warning messages, where like, you want to warn people, obviously, as they're logging in the bank account, that scam, this could be a scam, but there's all these blanket ones that really are just white noise. And doing something that's a bit more risk-based and intelligent, it might upset a few of your good customers, but if you're doing it for the high-risk ones where there's more of a high probability that it's a scam, then there's real value there. So I think whether it's there or at identity, at the identity verification stage, at the onboarding stage, there's definitely value, and I think we can be less scared of our customers being so turned off by this. If anything, sometimes they like the fact that they feel like their financial institution is looking out for them. Now, if it's every time they log into their account they get an OTP, that's really annoying, right? Like, it's like, okay, I've logged in here 14,000 times, like this is definitely me. But like, if it's one where it's like, oh yeah, that is a bit unusual of a transaction, that that I feel like I'm being looked after. So you can, it doesn't have to just be annoying friction, smart friction, which I guess is the purpose of it. It's to target the higher risk, and it's to also instill confidence that you're looking after your customers in an age where I think now everyone's very aware of the fraud and identity issues. It's not this big bad word that, don't mention it to your customers because you don't want them to know that there's fraud on your site. Like, people get it. They want to feel reassured without feeling ridiculously badgered by, things that are not super smart. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Good, thank you. Blair, smart friction.
PJ stole all my good points there. I mean, he just nailed it. I mean, it is all about risk-based authentication. It doesn't make sense if I'm logging into my Netflix account, although, from the password sharing stuff, you might have to do that at Netflix here someday soon. But I just got back. I spent 4 days in Las Vegas at a conference called FinTech Meetup, and exactly what PJ just said, I heard over and over and over from all these FinTechs that consumer sentiment has actually changed, and they really appreciate the fact that you're putting some extra assurance and some extra hurdles and some extra friction into the process, because it makes them feel safe about their money, it makes them feel safe about their assets, it makes them feel safe about their identity. So I think the digital transformation people within enterprises have gone maybe a little bit too far. They're trying to replicate what Amazon has, but Amazon has this rich history about you where they can be pretty confident in who they're dealing with on a daily basis. Most companies don't have that kind of rich data on you where they can be that confident. So I'm a believer in the friction. I think it makes all the sense, but in the right place. Don't inconvenience the hell out of me. I've logged in 14 times. I mean, come on. Give me 12 hours to where my acceptance of this is good, or 24 hours, or whatever the right configurable timeline is. But don't annoy me, but add some friction. It's good.
Yeah. Ken?
Which is a tough balance. That's a tough balance to do. So that's why people probably go away from friction altogether. It's like, how do we strike that right balance?
Yeah, no, it's tempting to want to, make the case for a frictionless environment, but I'm with you, Blair. I don't know that that's necessarily where consumers really want to be. In fact, I recall easily some studies about there was an FI, I believe it was in the UK, that removed passwords, usernames and passwords, and they were using some passive authentication means, and it really upset their customers, and they ended up reinstating it, even though they didn't really, necessarily use it. So I thought that was a fairly interesting one. But Ken, what do you think?
Well, first off, I'm a big fan of smart friction. I think we have to really move away from this concept of frictionless. I think the fraudsters have gotten just too demanding as far as how good they are. So you want an example of smart friction. In my mind, here's one. Let's take Zelle. Let's take you've got a senior citizen and has never used Zelle before, and the first transaction is $2,000. Why wouldn't I want to hold that for 4 hours as a bank? I mean, this probably is a scam going on, but for the most part, I know like myself, when my kids need money, I can send it to them, but they don't need it in 30 seconds. They just need it today. So I think that's one example. The other example would be the consumers might want to add their own friction. So let's say I'm using Zelle. I might want to say, I don't want anything to go in less than 4 hours or maybe even overnight. I don't need same day. I want to get it quickly, but let me decide. So maybe even having customers decide on friction, some levels. But I think we've gotten to so much where it's like everything has to be so fast and so frictionless, and the marketing people want to demonstrate this incredible speed and this incredible, almost invisible experience. But unfortunately, that's just not the world we're in now, where we're suffering a lot of serious fraud, the scams we talked about before. I mean, what should we be doing in the scam space? Definitely adding some more friction to help stop some of those things, especially when you have consumers like on the romance scams, they so believe that they're in love with someone on the internet and they're constantly sending money. And there was one recent case in the UK where the UK bank brought to the attention of the person that this is a scam and they just would not accept it. They kept sending money. And then eventually they wound up getting it all refunded because this was a vulnerable person. Their spouse had recently passed away. And so it was like, I think, let's say a six-figure number, but they wound up getting fully reimbursed, even though the bank did its best to convince the customer. So they tried to put friction in, but even there was reimbursement because it was a vulnerable person. Now in the UK, they're much more, I guess I'll say, aggressive about reimbursing than here in the United States. But I definitely think smart friction, again, don't do it at every logon. That makes nonsense. But smart friction, I think, is really important given how we're seeing the attacks occurring today. And we do want to protect the customers. And as a customer, I would like to see my bank do that too. I want my money protected. So I think I agree with you, Blair, and I'm glad to see the fintechs are seeing that because I just think it's important in what we do. It's not a minor thing anymore, but you want to be judicious where you deploy it. If you deploy it too often, then it almost loses its value. It loses the benefit of what you're doing. But it's got to be smart.
Sure. Speaking of Zelle, just a little shout out, kind of a follow up to that. I don't use it that often, but I've used it a couple times in the past couple months, and I received at least 2 different warnings before I could go through with the transaction saying, wait a minute, there are scams out here. Are you sure this is a real recipient? Are you sure this is a real need? And I think I got it at least twice just to check out, and I'm sending money to my daughter.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, so they're starting to get this, but I think a lot of that is because the liability's been on them. They're having to refund this money if it goes through and it happened to be a scam, which, is that really right? The person willingly accepted they're a vulnerable population, but how far can a bank go to know that this is a vulnerable person? Circumstances change. I'm perfectly healthy today. I could be, incapacitated somehow tomorrow. So circumstances change too. So it's hard to put the onus back on the financial institution. It seems to be where it's going, but is it right? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you hit on a key thing, Blair, about are things reimbursed or not reimbursed? And Trace and I have gone back and forth on that a lot. And one of the things they've seen in the UK, since they now have this reimbursement code, and soon will be a requirement for reimbursement on scams, is they've added more controls. And so some of those controls definitely add friction. They have the nudges that I think someone mentioned before. They have the confirmation of payee. So before you do the faster payment transaction, they check where you're sending it. And if it doesn't match the name, they tell you that. So I think that's another thing as you look at this. Here in the US, we generally have not reimbursed for any kind of scams. And it'll start, I think, Trace, if I'm not mistaken, in June, that in Zelle, for receiving banks, they'll now have to start to reimburse. And all that also gets you thinking about, okay, what else do I need to do? So it's not just fraud we look at, but scams. And again, Trace and I beat ourselves back and forth on this, but the scam dollar losses are dramatically larger than anything on the bank fraud side.
Well, they're very underreported too.
Yeah.
The thing that comes to
we don't
mind,
know how many there are.
yeah, because if we know one thing, it's that the victims of scams don't often report it. They certainly don't often report it. If they report it at all, they report it to their bank, and then secondarily to law enforcement. But so one of the things that came to mind, though, as we were having that little back and forth there were a lot of things. But one of the things that really popped out is that it's kind of use case dependent, right? The whole idea of introducing friction in there, because in some cases like scams, I think it's increasingly welcome to introduce some degree of friction. Just because you can, everyone can drive a Ferrari doesn't mean everyone should drive a Ferrari. Same with faster payments. In some cases, maybe you ought to slow it down a little bit. Because there are certain elements of risk there. But in other cases, like let's say at enrollment or maybe even authentication, right? Then you really kind of do want to try to step out of the way as much as possible. Is that fair? What do you guys think about that?
Well, let me ask that's a good one, but you bring up the question of enrollment. So Blair, I want to come to you with a question. As I'm analyzing, and right now I'm putting together a big report on online threats and so on, one of the things that concerns me at enrollment, especially when you get more advanced and you're getting like a physical driver's license or a passport, I'm getting concerned that the fraudster's ability, either if it's from a major foreign country or even people with buying some of their own equipment, that they're able to get the, let's say, driver's license to be high quality compared to, say, what the state of California or some other state would do. And as a result of that, I feel that I then have to put more friction on the enrollment part. But could you maybe clarify where the quality of fraudsters' ability as far as creating these, let's say, a driver's license and how it matches to what a real state does, and how concerned should the audience be about that?
I can absolutely talk about it, but I did take the privilege of pulling up a couple of websites in advance just to give you an idea. Can everybody see the screen, or am I okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. I mean, you just mentioned California. Where'd it go? There we go. So, I mean, it's so easy, Ken. It's gotten if you Google make fake IDs, I forget what the count on that is, but I think it's over 1 million different websites are going to pop up, and they've gotten super sophisticated. And this is what should really start to scare people from the beginning is they're starting with a real ID. So it's not really just a counterfeit ID. And this is a digital ID site where you can go in and type in whatever data that you want to appear, whatever face that you want to appear. But most of the document authentication technologies today are limited to visual inspection of the document. Are the holograms there? Are the state seals there? Does this pattern in the background match what we expect to see? Do we see the right overlays over the face? Those kind of things. So it's largely visual, but when you've got websites out there that are giving you the perfect template that started with a real ID, the patterns are perfect, the holograms are perfect, the state seals are perfect, the overlays are perfect. So it becomes a very difficult challenge. I mean, there's lots of fakes here. I don't want to scare everybody. There are a lot of mistakes that they're going to make. I mean, there is a number of security features well above and beyond just the visual security features. But if you were to present this to a human, if you've got humans in the loop looking at identity documents and and determining whether they're real or not, you're getting taken really bad. It takes forensic quality equipment and examination in order to be able to separate these really high quality fakes from from the also rans. And here's another one where it's all template. You can get these for anywhere in the world. I mean, it's not just the US. You want green cards or more sophisticated documents, and you can get things like, this is what starts to get scary. You've got fake birth certificates. So, with fake birth certificates, fake social security numbers in some states that don't validate that birth certificate directly with the issuer or the social security number directly with the SSN, to get a real ID, that's all you've got to present. And if there's no validation, you could actually go get a real one issued with some of the tools that are provided here. And then lastly, this one is scary as heck, guys. I mean, you go into fake name generator and look at this. I mean, just put in whatever kind of attributes you want to be, what you are, click generate, and it's going to give me a new name, a new address. It's a real address, the first portion of the social, mother's maiden name, the geo coordinates of where they live, exactly what their birthday is, and all that tends to be pretty close to what I am. So this could be an identity that I could use. And then you have things like, the height, weight. You got to make sure that that one is close to what you are. If you don't like it, just go click generate another one. But there's, UPS tracking numbers. There are our favorite. Here's the answers to your knowledge-based authentication questions. So yeah, it's a huge challenge, Ken, and it's super easy. The tools, and these are not deep websites that I pulled up. These are just standard, surface web tools that are available to anybody.
And how does that work if you're using let's say a driver's license as part of your enrollment? And so therefore it's just going to be showing the card on your phone camera or whatever versus a real forensic machine that you might have in a branch possibly. So in the online, how close do you get to being able to tell whether that license is good or not good as part of just your enrollment controls?
It's fascinating question, and I think you're going to be fascinated by the answer. So I come from that world where we use hardware in order to illuminate documents using all three light spectrums. And we had the privilege of having access to 400,000 different identity documents from all over the globe. So we took all of those, ran them through the hardware scanners with all three light spectrums, applied the forensic algorithms, recorded the results. Then took the same documents, turned off UV and infrared, just used visible light, which is exactly what you're getting you with the camera today. Ran the same documents through, analyzed those results. And what we found is there's zero statistical difference in your ability to detect the counterfeits using just visible light versus all three light spectrums. So pretty fascinating there. There are all kinds of different mistakes that they make that are tiny. I mean, going back to I won't go back to show my screen. There's all kinds of little things that they have to repeat. Like at the bottom, if you look at your driver's license, there's a long string called DD. It's a document discriminator number, and they'll get this. They'll get the length. They'll get the alphanumeric correct. But the document discriminator number, if you really know what a forensic examination is, tells you exactly what issuer within which DMV issued it on what date. And if you know how to analyze all that, that's very hard for the counterfeiters to get right and to get accurately because it's got to be done in the same county. That's just one example. We run about 600 different tests on an identity document. So, I think our guys say that we're able to detect about 99% of those, but we're always balancing, fraud detection with user experience too. We can't throw a flag with every anomaly that's detected.
Your key message would be you'd be concerned if someone is presenting a bogus driver's license to, say, a person in a branch, and that person in the branch, their ability to detect that would be very difficult versus what you're saying in the online, or if you're using some type of physical machine. That's kind of, I guess, the warning you have.
100%, Ken. I mean, it's impossible for a human. I'm an expert at this. I've been doing it for 12 years, and I'll admit that I'd probably be able to detect from me just visually looking at it, maybe 60% of the fake IDs. I'm going to miss a lot of them. because I
Okay.
can't be barred as 600 different algorithms that are analyzing this in real time. So visually, most of the fake IDs that I see look genuine.
Well, and my last thought, Trace, is one of the things I'm seeing when we talk about fraud is that there seems to be more people in the United States committing fraud. You've got like the notorious Nigerian Black Axe gang. You've got criminal gangs who are stealing all these US checks. And my sense is that there are more people walking into branches to either open accounts, cash checks, whatever. And if those branches are simply doing a visual on the driver's license, that could be another identity problem, maybe a little beyond our webinar today, but probably just to call it out as that part of identity involving the branch probably needs to be rethought.
I think that's a perfectly important point to make, and I'd argue that where it's sort of like Murphy's Law, you know, if something can go wrong, it will. If the fraudsters have a vulnerability or an opportunity to exploit, they will. And I certainly don't think that that the sort of the physical presence is a barrier for them necessarily. I think it's quite the opposite. I think they prefer the digital channel because it's so convenient and it's easy to scale. But you know, I'm coming off of a research effort where we talked with a lot of bankers in Brazil, and the trends there are frightening. I mean, we have kidnapping and hijacking where people are being held at gunpoint and told and directed to make transfers from their accounts to such a degree that the central bank actually began limiting the limits of what can be sent during the nighttime hours, because that's when all these things were happening. So yeah, granted, it's that's not where we're at here in the US, but I don't think it's inconceivable that we could get there given what I've seen with things like
Well,
check
we
fraud.
are seeing examples now of people being in bars and someone shoulder surfs the victim and
Yep.
picks up the code and then
And
robs the person of their phone and then does transactions. So we're starting to see some of what you described in Brazil, not the kidnapping and, you know, gun to the person, but we are seeing phones being stolen.
yeah. Well, Blair, to your point, and I do want to touch on sort of some of the best practices that you guys have seen out there with regard to managing identity. But before we get there, and Blair, to your point earlier, you know, about the ease with which you know, criminals are now able to falsify identity. We have a question that's come in. It says digital IDs and digital identity wallets are gaining momentum, especially in the EU and Canada. What's your take on this as it relates to the security of PII and fraud? Will it make people and businesses more vulnerable or less vulnerable to fraud?
My take is it's going to be less vulnerable. I mean, there's multi-factor, there's, you know, PSD2, so you've got to have multiple authentication factors there, so that in and of itself reduces it. If somebody has to biometrically unlock the public keys and the public key hasn't been compromised or the private key hasn't been compromised, you can be pretty confident of who you're transacting with at the end of the day online, you know, in a completely remote situation. So it's going to raise the bar pretty dramatically, I think, for the fraudsters, especially when we're talking about, you know, the ecosystem over there. We're doing system of record checks. So you assert your identity and your biometrics, but I'm validating who you are directly with the issuer. That's a pretty solid way to begin to vet. And then if you layer in some other things, let's make sure the device hasn't been jailbroken or hasn't been hijacked. Let's make sure you know, the GPS coordinates and all those kind of things line up with where it can be. Yeah, I think it's going to, you know, be fantastic. I hate that there's this framework out there, but there's a lot of dissension amongst those different countries on exactly how to implement. I'm a little bit concerned about interoperability. I want this to be able to work throughout, you know, all the European countries. And I think that's a challenge that yet remains to be tackled fully because of these different standards from country to country. But overall, I think it's a great move, and I hope it continues to proliferate here in the US.
Yeah, Certainly, I think encouraging. We had another question to come in, and I think it's also maybe aligned with where I kind of wanted to go anyway, which was around leading practices. But it certainly, so this question has to do with behavioral biometrics and really the distinction between behavioral biometrics and behavioral analytics, which I think is an important and under discussed topic, because there's I think there is a difference, and we don't talk about it. So I'll read the question and then I'll open it up for comments here. So we've heard a lot about behavioral biometrics when it comes to fraud prevention. Can you provide insights on the differences and significance of behavioral analytics versus behavioral biometrics? So who wants to start with that one? PJ?
I can
go ahead.
start, and then you guys can make it better. Behavioral biometrics by definition is kind of how an individual interacts and behaves with a device, whether it's a phone or keyboard, and monitoring that behavior, that actual interaction, the keystrokes, the pressure, kind of how you type, So those are, in my opinion, a subset of behavioral analytics. It's a type of behavioral analytics, in my view. It's a specific data stream, which is session data and how you're interacting with the device. That's the data you're using for behavioral biometrics. Behavioral analytics can understand user behavior through other things. It can be monetary or non-monetary information. It could be IP address. It could be digital information. And you use those data points and some type of analytics to analyze: is it anomalous? Is it not? Is it risky? Is it not? So I see it as kind of a subset of it. I think when you say behavior, we have behavior technology, sometimes it does get confusing. It's like, are you talking about behavioral biometrics, like that session data, or are you talking about a broader bucket of behavioral analytics, which can be much more, in my opinion. So curious your guys' thoughts, though.
Well, in particular, and Blair and Ken will be interested to hear from you guys again around how you've seen this actually deployed, in such a way that really makes it impactful. Again, distinguishing between the two. So Blair, you want to start with you?
Gosh, where have I seen it deployed successfully? I think banks have done a pretty good job, and I kind of agree with PJ in that analytics are a subset of the behavioral biometrics. I think behavioral biometric companies have become more of a platform, and they incorporate the analytics data into their whole analysis to make sure that it's really PJ and Ken still interacting with the device. So it's a combination of the data and the data points of how you interact, how you type, the pressure, what fingers you're using, those kind of things. And those have become surprisingly pretty accurate. It used to be just 1 to N. We would know the way that Ken interacted with his device, and we could know that it was Ken coming back the next time. Today, they've come so far that it can pick Ken out from, he doesn't have to assert any credentials, so they're able to do 1 to N. So just silently in the background based on what Ken is using. And the analytics have to be a part of that, because I need to know that it's a device that Ken's used in the past in order to, as a strong signal, to know whether I can trust that it's really Ken coming back again. But Ken, go ahead and add on to that.
I think between what you and PJ have done, I'll say, Trace, they've probably covered that question.
Yeah.
They did a good job, both of them, so I won't rehash it.
Maybe we'll double down on what Blair said. That the biometrics without the analytics may be a point of failure sometimes. Because I've come across more than a handful of folks who have used behavioral biometrics and feel that it was overhyped and that it underdelivers. And I think that oftentimes has to do with this, with a bad experience with a particular solution. But I think it often has to do also with whether or not they were able to actually incorporate those signals in a way that was more holistic. They gave them more of a holistic picture. In other words, if they're just consuming it in isolation, that's one thing. But if they're consuming it as part of a larger picture, that gives them gives them better insights into the identity, then that makes a big difference. So
That's the whole layering thing, Trace. I think
yeah,
that's how you get the best result, is
yeah.
you look at both things, several things together.
All right, I think we've got time for maybe one additional question that's just come across the wire. Let's see. How do you think companies should communicate smart friction to their consumers? Behind the scenes, we talk about frictionless and smart friction, but I have never heard of any of my institutions talk about how they are protecting me. So let's see. Ken, I'm going to start with that one.
I think that's a good question. I think it is important to communicate. I mean, it's almost like, again, when we take the world of scams, how do we communicate to customers about scams? Or if we put notices up there, how do we make it so someone's going to read it? So I think the same thing here is, if you're going to add smart friction, you really face those same questions I just raised. What's the best way to communicate it? And what's the way to communicate it such that the customer will understand what I'm doing, but also not create, a massive amount of fear. So I think you can definitely do that, but probably almost think about how you communicate the scam world, and you're trying to emotionally engage your customer, and use probably some of that same logic and same thinking, a little bit more psychology than just putting a notice out, would be what I would say.
So BJ, do you think we communicate enough, or do you think we should be doing a better job of communicating?
Yeah, I think it's the type of communications are often just not read, or they're just too much, like blanket emails saying, be careful of these scams, and most people don't read the emails, or just becomes, another warning. Some are better than others. Some are very, they try to differentiate and make it look like, but it's tough. It's really tough to reach consumers at scale. Email's the best device. You can do different social media campaigns and platforms like that, but it's really tough. And I think anything we can do to, whether it's scams or other ones, try to stand out in that email, in that messaging, in that, or put a whole campaign behind it on why you're taking these friction steps, and the protection that's behind it, the better. But it's not easy. There's no, banks would have thought of it and done it if and not blast you with these texts and messages that you're like, oh yeah, I know scams exist, and then you fall for a scam. So there's no great answer. I think if the education is a little bit more differentiating, a little bit more contemporary, that would break through the noise of all of the digital stuff that we get, the better. But that involves a lot of resources and a lot of time and commitment and creativity. Not always a bank's sweet spot, but we'll see.
Awesome. Well, it is at the top of the hour, and I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but it really flew by for me. I've really enjoyed this discussion with you guys, and I very much appreciate your insights. I hope that you, as the audience, have enjoyed it as well. I want to thank AuthenticID for sponsoring this great discussion. Blair, Ken, PJ, thank you guys so much.
Thanks for hosting us here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks for joining.